so the next oscillator we're going to talk about on the Arturia MiniFreak is the most complex one of all. That is virtual analog. Okay, this is going to take a lot of explanation. No, I'm just joking. Okay, it is pretty straightforward. And basically what it is a sawtooth wave and a square wave simultaneously. Which is nice. To be honest, if I were going to do a virtual analog, I would have had it so like not only was it a square and a saw, but the square and the saw both had natural variations in them that lent them to sounding like analog, not just a square and a saw, which in no way defines analog because obviously we have square and saw in digital synths the world over. But that's not a criticism. It's definitely a useful oscillator, especially because you have two oscillators going at once, which allows you a wide range of function, especially because you can have both of your the two oscillators of the MiniFreak set to this, and then you can split things up, as I'm about to show you how. So you could get, theoretically, with two iterations of the virtual analog oscillator on the MiniFreak to make a really big sound. And it's not bad to begin with. Okay, so the first knob is Detune, and what Detune does, it's the wave knob. The wave knob has the function that is detune so that you can detune the sawtooth compared to the square. Because everyone knows analog has one oscillator out of tune with the other, right? I'm just joking, but yes, that does lend it a sort of analog sound to have those oscillators beating against each other. And of course, if you stacked this, we're in oscillator 1, so if you went to oscillator 2 and stacked this with that, you'd have an even broader, more chorusy, detuning chorusy sound, which is awesome. But this is not just a detune. The wave / detune goes 2 octaves higher and 2 octaves lower. So and the benefit to this is if you go 2 octaves lower, what you have is a sub bass. So this is really an oscillator with a sub bass, which is cool. I think it's interesting that the sub bass is actually the saw, which I would think typically it would be the square. But anyway, it's a unique sound. And there's always the truth that if we have these separated by an octave and they're not quite in tune, so you can get a fuller, bigger sound by playing chords with 2 oscillators an octave apart. So you can imagine, again, if we doubled this up in oscillator 2 and you had 2 octaves there that were all detuned from each other, you'd have a really big sound. Perhaps an analog sounding sound. Now let's go to timbre, which is, I think, shape. Shape is the word. At 50%, you've got a square wave. The timbre knob basically affects the shape of the square wave in the square wave and sawtooth pairing. So below 50% with the timbre knob gives you pulse width modulation. Which is super cool. The cool thing about it, though, is that this pulse width modulation, this pulse width adjustment, goes all the way to 0%. So listen what happens. All of a sudden, all we have is the sawtooth. So if you want just the sawtooth, that's how you get just the sawtooth in the V analog oscillator. Because it allows a pulse width of 0. As you might know, when we are changing or modulating the pulse width of the square wave, we're making the square more and more into a rectangle, and then it will get to a point where that rectangle is so thin that it vanishes, and then we don't have a square wave, and that's a wave of nothing, which is why we can't hear the square right now. That's a very nice saw sound. Okay, so you go back up to 50%, and then you have, here, let's get them both in tune with each other again. So now with our timbre / shape, we have just a square wave, but if you go above 50%, you get into sync, the traditional analog sync sound. You can use that as a timbre in itself, or you can modulate it and get that traditional sync sound. If you want to do that Cars song, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so that is the timbre knob. Then we have the shape knob, which actually is wave, and what it does is it adjusts the waveform of the sawtooth. So you basically have a sort of, dare I say this, it's not technically accurate, but it gives you the sense, kind of a pulse width modulation for the saw. If you go above 50%, that's where you're getting different harmonic content for the saw. And it even has a point where it disappears. And we're just to the square wave. So you have the ability in your V analog oscillator to decide, okay, do I want both the square and the saw? Maybe I just want the square or just want the saw. And so you can carve out the one that you don't want by using the various shape, timbre, shape, and shape wave. It gets a little bit confusing with these multiple names. But let's go back. And then below, okay, so you have this sort of, quote, pulse width modulation, which isn't pulse width modulation, quote, unquote, for the saw. And then below 50, you have the sawtooth decreases into a triangle. So let's take our square out so we can hear this triangle. So weirdly, by turning this to triangle, you get rid of the saw, and using the pulse width modulation to remove the width of the square, you can just have a triangle. It's kind of a novel approach. And if you want a triangle and square wave, you can bring your square back in. And since now the shape control, which is wave, controls the triangle wave, and triangle waves are really great for bass, you could drop that triangle wave down 2 octaves. So there's kind of your sub bass. And if you were just to... And because the triangle wave is unobtrusive, you could use it to double up your square wave to give your square wave kind of this fullness. Because right now we have a triangle wave an octave lower than the square wave, and it really kind of fills out the square wave without seeming like you've got chords in 2 octaves. So imagine now what you could do with, you could have your controller set up to like push out the square, or you could just erase the square from the mix, or erase the saw from the mix, or you could modulate both the square and the saw simultaneously with 2 different modulators, like the 2 different LFOs, in order to have both of them having kind of a pulse widthy sound, which would really thicken this up and definitely give it a big fat analog sort of sound. And then you could detune them. Oh, let's try this. By simply pressing the hold button, I've given myself the opportunity to fake modulation of the wave shape of both the timbre and shape settings, which are shape and wave by name in the screen. So that saves me sitting here trying to patch that to two different LFOs and all the settings associated with that. So that's kind of a cool trick. But yes, so you have a great deal of possibility with this super simple oscillator, which is just waveforms basically. But because you have the ability to adjust detuning, you have the ability to set it to two different notes, you have the ability to do pulse width modulation and sync, or saw wave manipulation, or triangle. I mean, it's really as low featured as it seemed. It's a full featured oscillator. Anyway, that is the V analog oscillator found on the Arturia MiniFreak.